Hi, are you considering buying your first car in the UK? And are you unsure about what criteria you need to select in order to buy your first car? Then you need to watch this video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the key considerations and criteria that you should be selecting when buying a first car. And I'll also be talking about my own personal experience when I bought my first car in the UK.
Get strong.
Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Arjun and this is the Nimble Nomad. On this channel, we talk about the tips, tricks and hacks to survive and thrive in the UK. In this video, I'm actually going to be talking about the criteria for selecting and buying your first car, especially if you've never actually owned one or are in the process of buying a new car. So if you look on YouTube, actually there's a whole bunch of videos about how to find a used car, what are the technical elements that you need to look at when you're buying a used car or a new car, and a whole bunch of various bits and pieces. But this video is actually specifically talking about what you need to think about when you first start considering to buy a car. So what are the criteria and what are the basic fundamentals you need to, as a personal individual, think about when you're buying a first car for yourself in the UK. I'm going to do a separate video around what are the costs around associated with buying a car, and I'm also going to do a separate video about what specifically are the finance options that come to when you purchase a new car or a used car in the UK. So a bit of background, we bought our first car actually a year ago now, and we bought it primarily because my wife had gotten a new job and she needed a car actually to commute. It was quite a distance that she would be traveling, almost 70 miles a day. So we really needed a car just because the costs associated with using public transport were just ridiculous, and also the time that it would take her to get to work would just be insanely high when she had to travel using a train. So we decided to get a first car a year ago essentially. Now, when we tried to buy our first car, there were a whole bunch of considerations and options and factors that we had to think about. So this video is going to run through all the basics of things that I personally thought about when we were buying our first car. So hopefully it helps you out. So let's get into that. Now, actually, before I get into the criteria that you should be selecting for your car, what I want to just explain is what typical people end up doing is they automatically jump straight into the marketplace and start looking at, different cars and what kind of options you can get. Now, I think that's a very naive option, because you can get very easily sucked into this whole idea that if I had a little bit more money, I can buy a nice car, or I can do this, or I can do that. I think what you need to do is you need to actually define a set of parameters and criteria, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in the video that I'm just running through now. So just make sure you do these fundamental steps of identifying what the parameters are before you jump into searching for specific cars and car models. So the first and most important bit that you want to think about when you're buying a car is your budget. And I'm now specifically talking about only the budget for buying a car. There are other costs associated with buying a car in the UK, such as tax and the annual insurance that you need to pay for your car. But I'm only talking about the budget for buying your car. So this is quite important because you need to set your budget and you need to stick to that budget. What you can end up in a scenario is when you're buying a car, when you start looking, is you'll automatically feel, well, if I had an extra £1,000 or an extra £500, then I could get a nicer car or extra features. I think just set a budget based on what you can afford and basically work off back of that, because once you define that budget, you'll be able to define how much you can afford on a month-on-month basis, and then you have to add on other operational costs associated with running a car every year. Just to give you a bit of context as well, you will need to set aside an additional amount, usually in the range of £1,500 to £2,000, especially if you're a first-time, purchasing your car, you have no driving history in terms of owning a car, and no claims discount just for the insurance costs, and also for taxing your car every year. Of course, it depends on what kind of car you end up buying, but you need to think about that additional cost in addition to your purchase price for the car. So just to context, I'll go into a separate video for the details on operational costs for running a car later on. Okay, so the second thing, and this is directly interlinked with the budget associated with the car, is, well, what is the option that you're going to go for when trying to purchase the car? So are you going to pay cash all out and just buy the car outright, or are you going to go for a finance option? So obviously this depends on whether you buy a new or used car, but these are other factors that you want to think about when you're setting your budget as well. So maybe you've got that cash up front, right? So maybe you've got that 5, 10, whatever grand that you have to buy a used or a slightly new car, and basically you just decide to go outright cash. But there are other options. So there are 3 or 4 options which come to purchasing a car. So you can either do a lease, you can do a contract hire, you can buy the car outright, or you can get like a loan for a difference between the deposit that you put down and then pay off the car over a period of time. So again, I'll do a separate video which goes into a bit more detail, but this is an important factor when considering buying a car in addition to setting your budget. So these are the absolute crucial points of buying a car. Criteria number 3 is actually defining the purpose of the car. So this is very personal, but is a very important factor in defining what and how you're going to purchase the car. So basically, you might be a single person, or you might just be a young couple. In that case, you don't really need like a SUV, right? Unless you really have the money to splurge, then you don't actually need that. You need maybe a hatchback or a simple small car which can get you from point A to point B. But if you're a family, and especially if you've got a big family, let's say you've got 4 kids, then you need an estate or an SUV so you can lug everybody around and all the additional stuff that you need in order to carry the stuff around. So this is really important because it defines your budget. It also defines the kind of models and makes of cars that you can be looking at. So you need to define the purpose of the car. What are you going to actually use it for? So apart from who you are, is what are you going to use it for? Are you going to use it for weekend trips, or are you going to use it daily for commuting? So again, another factor to think about when you're considering buying a car. Okay, so the next thing that you want to think about is whether you want to buy a brand new car or whether you want to buy a used car. Once you've identified the first 3 criteria, actually, to be honest, you can do this right up front, just at the outset of everything, whether you want a new or a used car. But obviously this depends on person to person. So for me personally, I was always set that I would buy a used car because I've always believed that new cars are just a waste of money, and I don't believe cars are an asset because they just depreciate immediately as soon as you drive out of the dealership. So a used car for me was a no-brainer essentially. The other thing is, obviously, if it's your first car, you are going to end up with some dings, scratches, dents and things like that. So if you buy a slightly used car, you're not going to feel as bad as owning a brand new, shiny, sparkly car. Because if you do end up with those dings and dents, then it's not really that bad. Okay, so now we're going to get into features and age and use. So this obviously depends, right? So if you decide to buy a brand new car, then all you need to do is just select the features that are absolutely critical to you. And when I mean features is, what are the must-haves in terms of capability within the car? So do you need a power steering? Do you need like heated seats? Do you need air conditioning? All of those different factors that come with actually owning a car, and these are quite personal actually, so they depend person to person. Of course, if you're buying a used car, then there's additional thing to think about, which is, well, what is the minimum that I will have as a used car? So is 20,000 miles the minimum use that I will accept, or is it 40,000, or is it 100,000, right? Because that again then goes back into your budget, which is, well, so if it's 100,000 miles run, then that car is going to be significantly cheaper compared to a 20,000 miles car, but also it'll be significantly older as well, because the car would have been used by that many people. Of course, the other aspect to think about is ownership and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of variations and factors that you need to think about. I'll obviously get into what I thought about when we were looking at buying a car later on, when I talk about my personal experience later in this video. Okay, so before we get into the last criteria that you want to look at, and this is the fun part of the criteria selection, is just write down everything that I've just talked about in this video so far. So what you want to do is just basically make a notepad or take a notepad, write down everything from perspective of all those criteria, and basically have that as your baseline, and don't move once you've defined that, right? Because once you get into the next step, then you can get easily swayed. So the next step actually is the fun part, which is now you go online and start looking at the various cars, the models, the makes, and the options that you can get with them, right? And then you start seeing the price ranges. So you've written down all the stuff that you will absolutely accept, and then you go onto the websites for the dealerships or Auto Trader or elsewhere in the UK, and then you start selecting your car. So this is where you actually say, okay, start narrowing down the different options of which cars you are willing to look at or go for a test drive and actually purchase. And then you can actually see where the makes actually fit into your buckets of selection and where they don't. Just with this specific criteria, when you're actually starting to look at options, you in the UK you'll have two options. One is either you can purchase directly from the dealerships. A lot of the dealerships in the UK actually have used cars for sale, and then obviously you can purchase privately, right? So if I decided now suddenly to sell my own car, then that's personally a private purchase that I'm going to be making if I bought it from somebody off the street. Obviously there's differences, pros and cons with both. So dealerships will be slightly more expensive, but at the same time you have some consumer rights, right? So you can basically say if something's gotten wrong, or if it's not what was promised to you, then you can go back to them and complain about it. Obviously when you buy it privately, then you need to do all the checks and make sure that the car is exactly in fact what it is, but also at the same time you're getting a cheaper deal. So pros and cons, but again, something to think about if you're buying a used car through either of those options. Okay, so let's talk about my personal experience with purchasing a car. So like I said at the beginning of the video, we bought a car a year ago. And the primary purpose of that car was for my wife to drive to work, essentially. We wouldn't have bought a car otherwise. I mean, it was absolutely critical for us to buy the car, and that's the only reason we actually purchased one. So what I'll do is I'll try and explain the same approach that I adopted, which is through the criteria for purchasing our car. So like I said earlier in the video, right from the outset, I said I wanted a used car. I just felt like buying a new car was a complete waste of money, and we'd end up paying a premium on something that was going to depreciate in value over time. So a used car was an absolute criteria for me right at the outset. In terms of budget, actually we had a pretty sizable budget. So we had approximately set aside about 15 grand, just because we didn't know how much cars actually cost and what they are valued at. But at the same time, I wanted a specific type of car. So I wanted a hybrid car, which basically is a bit more expensive than a standard car because they're slightly newer and have come about in recent years. And the other aspect was we wanted a slightly newish car as well, because we were going to buy this car and hold it for life, essentially. And the other aspect, because my wife was driving for such a long distance, what I didn't want was a really old car which could then have a risk of breaking down on a motorway in the middle of the UK winter, which is just absolutely not acceptable. So that's why we had a really big budget. Obviously that sounds a bit unreasonable to a lot of people, but for me that worked for us as a criteria, and it was a requirement because my wife needed it. Okay, so then what we did was, okay, we decided that we were actually going to buy the car through a dealership actually, rather than through private, just again because I didn't know how the system worked, and I felt a lot more safer and conservative buying through a dealership, just because it was a known quantity, and if something went wrong I could go back and tell them about it and they would fix it essentially. Okay, so going into the features, and because it was a used car, what was the minimum criteria we were set to? So one of the main features that my wife absolutely insisted on was that it had to have a rear parking camera, because she struggles with parallel parking a little bit. And then the other bit was heated seats for her in the mornings, because she wakes up really early and has to drive to work. Heated seats was an absolute important requirement, and actually it did, like in practice it really was important, because when it gets cold in the winter, you get into your cold car, it really does make a difference when you have a heated seat switched on. So those are key features for us. From a perspective of use and mileage, I personally felt that anything around the 20,000 mile mark was okay. I mean, to be honest, I could have gone up more, but I just, I mean, with dealerships and the cars they hold, I mean, 20,000 was what you were finding anyway as well. So I kind of said, okay, 20,000 miles on a car will be acceptable as a stopgap for the kind of car that we're looking for. Okay, so then we sort of landed on, okay, what is the make and model? Now, I was set, right? I was really set that I wanted a Toyota. Actually, to be honest, before any of the criteria came out, I already in my mind had made up that we would buy a Toyota. And that's it's a bit weird to think of it that way, but one of the main reasons is because my dad had a Toyota and he's always sworn by it. He absolutely loves his Toyota, and to be honest, I also have studied in Japan, so for me, having a Toyota is something that I'm very comfortable with, owning a Japanese-made Toyota car, because I know that they're reliable. I've seen how they manufacture the cars when I've gone to their factory, so I'm very comfortable with how Toyotas are manufactured, maintained, and the cost of maintaining these is actually quite cheap. So ultimately, in the end, we decided that we bought a Toyota in the end. It was a 2016 model. It had about just under 14,500 miles on it, and it was a hybrid, so it hit all the boxes. It was actually a Toyota Auris. Basically, it was a really nice car, and I'm really happy with our purchase. Alright guys, so that's all I wanted to cover in this video. I hope this helped you out if you're looking to buy a car. Just remember, I'm going to be doing a couple more videos around this topic specifically, so please subscribe and like if this video helped you out. It also helps the channel out as well, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks very much. Goodbye.